See, here's what you need to understand, is that fighting and arguing are two completely different things. Alright, so let's define arguing for a moment here. Arguing is basically when two or more people debate a certain topic to come towards a resolution or to come towards an agreement. Whereas fighting is all about winning. It's about proving that you're right. Arguments usually arise as a result of unmet expectations or miscommunication or harm, and that harm may be physical or emotional or mental. It could be intentional or unintentional. Either way, those are usually the things that lead up to an argument. You know, when I think of arguments and how they come to be, I'm reminded of one of my favorite TV shows that I used to watch when I was growing up that really encapsulates all of these things: miscommunication, harm, and unmet expectations. See, I used to watch this show called Friends, and in Friends, there's these two characters. One of them is Ross, and another is Rachel. Now, the thing is, these two characters have a thing for each other. You know, they were dating for a while, and things were great at first. But eventually, there were some instances of miscommunication or unmet expectations, followed up by harm in the form of betrayal. But basically what happened was Ross and Rachel, they had been dating for a while, but Rachel had a very demanding career. And because of that career, she wasn't able to spend that much time with Ross or be very present as his girlfriend. But the problem is that Ross had actually expected her to make more time for him because they were in a relationship. While he did care about her career, he made the statement in one of their arguments that he felt like he didn't even have a girlfriend anymore. And I won't get into whether or not the relationship they had was healthy or not, but this is just an example of how things can lead up to an argument. Because what happened after Ross and Rachel had their confrontation, Rachel actually said that she felt like they needed a break, which for her meant a step back. It meant for some space, some time, not necessarily a breakup or that she didn't care anymore about Ross, but she needed time to figure out her life, to work on her career, and to do those things. However, what Ross heard was that she wanted to break up with him, that she didn't want a relationship with him anymore. What then happens is that Ross proceeds to cheat on Rachel. Now, I say cheat in quotations because it really depends on whose side you're looking at. For Ross, he thought that he and Rachel were broken up. But for Rachel, she thought that she and Ross were just on a temporary break. But regardless of who you think is right or wrong, that act of Ross sleeping with another woman led to Rachel feeling betrayed, and that is where the harm comes in. So already we've seen unmet expectations in that Ross expected to have more time with his girlfriend, and Rachel expected Ross to understand that she needed time to focus on career. We have miscommunication in that Rachel said she wanted a break, but for her, a break meant different from what Ross interpreted. And 3, we have harm, which is the betrayal, the sleeping with another woman, and that whole case. So it only really takes one of those things to trigger an argument, to trigger confrontation. But when you have 2 or all 3 of those things at once, it makes it really difficult to have a level-headed conversation. And that brings me to the discussion of why people argue in the first place. People argue because they want to be right, because they want to vocalize their feelings, because they want validation. Sometimes people argue because they feel threatened or they want to attack someone. Or maybe they're trying to gain control or power over the end result. Regardless of the motive behind the argument, I really want you to focus on the goal of the argument so that you don't turn it into a fight, but rather a productive conversation and discussion. Because, as I said earlier, the goal of an argument is come towards a resolution, conclusion, or agreement. And the first thing you have to do is resist the urge to attack. It can be really tempting to gain the upper hand by discrediting someone and invalidating their opinions, perhaps bringing up other arguments that may or may not be related to the argument that you're having, or perhaps even distorting their words and taking them out of context. You may also find yourself wanting to use accusatory or blanket statements to really emphasize your points. An accusatory statement is when you frame a statement in a way that makes it sound as though the other person did something intentionally to cause harm. A bad example would be, you hurt me by not asking me what I wanted in my coffee. The important thing to recognize here is how that statement is framed, because it would come off less accusatory if you said, when you didn't ask me what I wanted in my coffee, I felt hurt. An example of blanket statements are when you take one instance and apply that to an entire timeline, saying words like always, never, every time, statements that come off very absolute or ignorant of nuance or inconsiderate of circumstance. What you have to understand is that if you choose to do any of these things, one, you're just going to destroy your relationships. But two, you're adding fire to the flame. You're only going to put the other person in a defensive stance and make them angry towards you. And all those things, while they can be tactics for winning an argument, they're really just tactics for lashing out and fighting and hurting your opponent. So it's very important to distinguish your motivation here. Remember, an argument is a confrontational discussion with the intent of reaching common ground or a resolution or an agreement, versus a fight is a battle to defeat your opponent and prove that you are right. If you go into an argument with the intention of fighting, you've already lost, because even if you're able to prove yourself right, the other person will only concede reluctantly. They might not actually be convinced of your stance and they may harbor contempt for you. But if you go into an argument with the intent to collaborate, the other person is much more likely to cooperate and be receptive to what you have to say. And that's why it's so important to be gentle in our confrontation. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 to 25 says, "And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth." In these verses, the Apostle Paul is calling on us to put aside our desire to fight and to instead approach confrontation with gentleness. And something to keep in mind is that hearts are not swayed by condemnation, but rather by mercy, grace, kindness, and gentleness. People often mirror the social cues that they're met with. So if you approach them with the desire to understand, they're that much more likely to try to understand you as well. And by the same token, when we attack someone and not the issue at hand, we put them in a very defensive state, and they're no longer concerned with sound reasoning, but rather with defending themselves and winning the battle. If you attack someone in an argument, you're going to force them into a position where they feel that they have to fight and win. So in order to argue effectively, we need to shift or reframe the argument to one of discussion, collaboration, and resolution. See, we have a general tendency to believe that we're right. And so it's very easy to become offended or feel insulted whenever someone argues against us. And when that happens, you need to remember three things. 1, the wisdom in what Paul says in 2 Timothy. 2, to argue your case with a clear mind and sound reasoning. And 3, to be patient with the other person, especially if the argument is forcing them to confront something that they've believed for a very long time. And that brings me to my next point, which is that you have to remember that your opponent thinks that they are right. So you have to try to understand where they're coming from and why they believe what they believe. After all, it's very possible that both of you may be wrong, right? You may be right about something and they may be right about something, and overall, both of you may still be collectively wrong. Remember that no one has all the information. You're probably missing some information. They're probably missing some information. There's probably something contextual that you don't understand about the person, or maybe there are just other variables that you haven't considered yet. Add that to the fact that everyone interprets information differently. Everyone's experiences, knowledge, skills, understanding of the world, they all factor into how they interpret things that are said, things that are happening, and every person is unique in that way. So while something may make a lot of sense to you, it may not make the same sense to the other person. You have to recognize that their experiences led them to believing what they believe now. And the great thing about keeping that in mind is that it helps you detach from the argument itself, because you're starting to realize and understand where they're coming from, and they're not necessarily attacking you. They're just operating off of their beliefs that they've developed and held for a long time. So remember, they're not attacking you. They're just defending what they think is right. So listen to them and listen to what they have to say. And after they've said their piece, after they've said everything that they needed to say, after they've presented their case, most people are then willing to listen to everything that you have to say, and most people are willing to be patient to hear you out. And then, even if it seems repetitive, give as much information as you can and as much contextual information as you can so that they can understand where you are coming from and that they can then understand you. Some small detail to you can make a huge difference to them, because that may be the piece of information that they didn't know or that they didn't understand. So remember that just as you may not know exactly where they're coming from, they may not know where you're coming from either. So to have a productive argument, you need to understand where they're coming from, and you need to help them understand why you're arguing what you're arguing. And all of that goes hand in hand with de-escalating the confrontation. It's making sure they feel heard and that their emotions are validated. Now, this is going to be a test of your listening skills, because you may disagree or feel offended by what they have to say. But it's important to allow them to vocalize how they feel. Although you may believe that the reason behind their feelings may be wrong or misguided, their feelings are real. And your goal is to get to the bottom of what's actually making them feel upset. One of the biggest reasons why people feel frustrated or angry before and during arguments is that they don't feel heard. But if you can get them past that point, make them feel that their emotions are validated, hear them out on what they have to say, you'll be able to discuss things more calmly, logically, and rationally. And remember, when you do that, they'll be much more likely to hear you out and allow you to lay out your case without interrupting you. Just keep in mind that when you do lay out your argument, to present it without contempt towards them. That's not to say you should deny how you feel, but rather to just let go of any ill will you have towards them. After all, Paul also writes in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 to 32. He says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." If we want to work towards a solution, if you want to argue effectively, we need to approach each argument with kindness. Coming at your opponent with anger and inflammatory statements will only worsen the existing situation, and it's going to make it that much more difficult to come to a resolution. And that brings me to my last point, which is if we want to come to a resolution and have a productive and effective argument, we need to stay solution-oriented. One of the ways you can do this is to find common ground and figure out what you both agree on. Because the thing is, most people want the same thing. They just disagree on the methodology or the means to achieving what they want. For example, most people would agree that schools should be kept safe and that gun safety should play a key role in protecting students. For one person, that may mean a campus-wide ban on guns to prevent a gun-equipped attack. For someone else, that may mean equipping teachers with guns and educating them how to use it so that they can use the guns in self-defense and protect the students. See, that's just one of many scenarios where a lot of people want the same result, but just disagree on the ways that they want that result to be achieved. And that's something very important to keep in mind in any of your arguments, whether they be trivial or more hard-hitting or more personal to you. Because you also have to keep in mind, there may be some people who agree with you on the methodology and the means, but may disagree with you on the impact that they want to have or what the end result they want to be. In those times of disagreement, remember to find common ground and try to work towards a solution rather than attacking them or inflaming their statements. Because if you shift the argument from a solution-oriented conversation to one of an attack to one of fighting, you are just going to lose the argument. So don't waste your time by pointing out every instance that they offended you or wronged you. Focus only on the things that are important for the argument. So here's the TLDR. 1. Resist the urge to attack. 2. Be gentle with your confrontation. 3. Remember that going into an argument, your opponent is always going to think that they are right. 4. De-escalate the situation, de-escalate the argument, and hear them out. 5. Stay solution-oriented. And if you do all of those things, you're going to have much more effective arguments, and your arguments are going to be less tense, less inflammatory, and you're going to work towards a solution much faster with less feelings being hurt all around. If this video was helpful to you and you want to save this to remember it for later, one of the easiest ways you can do that is to just hit the like button, because once you do that, that's going to save it to your liked videos playlist. That's also going to help more people like you find this video and hopefully be helped by this video. So I hope you do that, and I hope this was really helpful and beneficial to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.